In 1478, inside a cathedral, during Sunday Mass, a man was stabbed 19 times. His brother died on that floor. He survived. And what he did next made an archbishop wish he had never drawn breath. This was not a crime of passion. This was a conspiracy, years in the making, backed by some of the most powerful men in Europe. And the revenge that followed was unlike anything the Renaissance had ever seen. What happened in Florence in 1478 begins and ends with one family, the Medici. Not kings, not warlords, bankers. They had no crown, no army, no noble blood to speak of. What they had was money, and in Renaissance Italy, money was everything. Their bank stretched across 8 countries. They lent to kings, to emperors, to the church itself. If you wanted to build a cathedral, fund a war, or quietly buy a political favor, you went through Florence. You went through the Medici. At the center of all of it stood Lorenzo de Medici, 30 years old, known across the continent as Il Magnifico, the Magnificent. He ran Florence the way a Grand Master runs a chessboard, always 3 moves ahead, never rattled. Botticelli painted for him. A teenage Michelangelo lived in his household like a son. The greatest minds of the age sat at his dinner table. To the people of Florence, Lorenzo was not just a banker. He was the city itself. But power like that always has a price. And somewhere across Florence, a rival family had already started planning his funeral. But the people who wanted him dead were not who you would expect. One of them wore a crown made not of gold, but of God. The Pazzi were Florence's second most powerful banking family. Second. That single word defined everything about them. For decades, they had watched the Medici collect every contract, every title, every ounce of influence they believed was rightfully theirs. The hatred between these two families was not political, it was personal. The slow, burning kind that builds up over generations. Francesco de Pazzi was the one who finally acted on it. Ambitious, calculating, and absolutely convinced that Florence would be better off under Pazzi control, he began assembling a conspiracy. The allies he recruited tell you everything about how far this went. Francesco Salviati, the Archbishop of Pisa, a man of the church who carried a personal grudge against Lorenzo after being passed over for a position he wanted. He did not merely join the plot, he helped architect it. Then came the mercenaries, hired soldiers brought in from outside Florence to ensure the job was done with precision. And then, the name that makes this story almost impossible to believe. Pope Sixtus IV, the head of the Catholic Church. Historians are in broad agreement. Sixtus knew. He approved. The Vatican was behind it. A pope, a banker, an archbishop, hired killers, all aligned on one outcome. Lorenzo de Medici had to die. The only question remaining was where, and the answer they settled on was designed to send a message to all of Florence. They didn't just want him dead, they wanted the city to see it happen, and they chose the most sacred place in Florence to do it. The first plan was poison. A private dinner, a quiet death, nothing traceable. It fell apart when the dinner was cancelled. The second plan was an ambush on the road outside the city. Too exposed, too many variables, abandoned. So Francesco de Pazzi went back to the table and put forward something that gave even his co-conspirators pause. They would strike inside the Florence Cathedral, Santa Maria del Fiore, the most iconic building in the city, on a Sunday morning during Mass, when the cathedral would be packed with the most powerful people in Florence. The moment chosen was the elevation of the host, the single most sacred point of the Catholic Mass. The priest raises the consecrated bread. Every head in the building bows. Every eye turns downward. Nobody would see it coming. Two teams of assassins, two targets, Lorenzo and his brother Giuliano, one signal, the ringing of the consecration bell. They chose a house of God deliberately. They chose the holiest moment of the week deliberately. This was not simply an assassination attempt. It was a declaration that the Pazzi were prepared to do what no one else in Florence had dared. On the morning of April the 26th, 1478, they made good on that declaration. What happened next inside that cathedral would be talked about across Europe within days, and it would set in motion a revenge that nobody in Florence was prepared for. Sunday morning, the cathedral fills. Lorenzo arrives, his brother Giuliano shortly after, greeted at the entrance by Francesco de Pazzi himself, who embraced him like an old friend. While embracing him, Francesco was doing something else. He was checking whether Giuliano was wearing armor beneath his clothing. He was not. The Mass begins. The assassins move into position. The bell rings. Francesco de Pazzi drove a blade into Giuliano 19 times, with such violence that he accidentally stabbed himself in the leg. Giuliano de Medici died on the cathedral floor. Across the nave, a second assassin lunged at Lorenzo. A priest. One of the killers was a priest. The blade caught Lorenzo's neck. A wound, but not fatal. Lorenzo drew his sword, wrapped his cloak around his arm as a shield, fought back. His companions surrounded him, pushed through the chaos of the screaming crowd, and got him through the altar and into the sacristy. The bronze doors slammed shut behind them. Lorenzo de Medici was alive. Outside, Archbishop Salviati had already moved to seize the government palace, expecting to announce a new order in Florence before the afternoon was out. It did not go the way he had planned. Giuliano was dead. The conspirators believed they had won. But Lorenzo was still breathing, and a wounded Medici was the most dangerous thing Florence had ever seen. Within the hour, Florence knew everything, and Francesco de Pazzi had made a catastrophic miscalculation. He had assumed the city would be relieved, that people would step into the streets and breathe, finally free from the weight of Medici control. Florence did the opposite. The Medici battle cry, "Palle, Palle," rose from the streets before the bodies had been moved. Armed men loyal to Lorenzo appeared at every corner. The Pazzi's own allies began to quietly disappear. Suddenly, no one knew anything about any conspiracy. Archbishop Salviati, who had marched to the government palace to declare a new Florence, found the doors barred and his mercenaries in disarray. His entire plan collapsed in under an hour. Francesco de Pazzi had spent months building this moment. He had believed Florence was waiting to be liberated. What Florence was actually waiting for was to make someone pay. And Lorenzo did not have to lift a finger. What came next was not chaos. It was not a mob in the streets. It was something far more calculated and far more permanent. Lorenzo's revenge was not fury. It was precision. Francesco de Pazzi was found at the Pazzi Palace, still bleeding from the wound he had inflicted on himself. He was dragged into the street and hanged from the windows of the Palazzo della Signoria, Florence's seat of government, in full view of the city below. Archbishop Salviati was taken shortly after, still dressed in his full religious vestments, hanged from the same windows. an archbishop, in his robes, swinging from a government building, while Florence watched. Over 80 conspirators were hunted down, executed, exiled, stripped of everything they owned. One fled to Constantinople. Lorenzo sent word to the Sultan. The Sultan returned him. He was hanged in Florence 2 years later. There was nowhere to go. And then Lorenzo went after something beyond the men themselves. The Pazzi coat of arms was physically chiseled off every building in Florence where it appeared. The family name was declared illegal. Anyone born a Pazzi was required by law to change it. Portraits were destroyed. Records altered. Lorenzo did not simply want them punished. He wanted them removed from history entirely. Botticelli, the same man who would paint the birth of Venus, was commissioned to paint the faces of the hanged conspirators on the outer walls of the government palace. A permanent public record of what happened to those who moved against the Medici. It stayed there for years. But one man had not yet been touched. The man who had approved the entire conspiracy from the beginning. And reaching him would require Lorenzo to make the most audacious move of his life. Pope Sixtus IV did not accept defeat quietly. He excommunicated Lorenzo, then excommunicated the entire city of Florence. Every soul within its walls, cut off from the sacraments, from last rites, from any recognition by the Church. Then he brought in the King of Naples and declared war on Florence outright. Most rulers facing a papal alliance and a military conflict would have negotiated from behind fortified walls and hoped for the best. Lorenzo boarded a ship, alone, no army, no formal escort. He sailed directly to Naples to negotiate face-to-face with King Ferdinand, the same man currently at war with him. He stayed 3 months, and he came home with a peace agreement. Ferdinand withdrew from the conflict, abandoned the Pope's alliance entirely. Sixtus, now isolated and exposed, quietly lifted the excommunication. The man who had sanctioned Lorenzo's assassination ended up signing a peace with him instead. Lorenzo returned to Florence in the spring of 1480, to a city that received him not as a banker or a politician, but as something the Medici had never officially claimed to be: a leader. He had survived the knife, the archbishop, the pope, the war. When the dust finally settled over Florence, the Medici were still standing. Everyone else was not. Here is what history recorded. Francesco de Pazzi died hanging from a government window. The archbishop died beside him, still in his robes. Over 80 conspirators were hunted across Europe. A family name was erased from the city entirely. Lorenzo de Medici ruled Florence for another 15 years. The Renaissance continued. The arts, the architecture, the philosophy, all of it flourished under Medici patronage in the years that followed. Whether what Lorenzo did was justice or revenge, history never officially decided. It simply recorded what happened and left the question open. 500 years later, it is still open. The Pazzi planned it. The Pope blessed it. Lorenzo buried them all. Who's the villain? Comment below.